Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Never Mind the Dam Busters, the RAF Bircham Command podcast with me, James Jeffries, and my co-host, Jane Gulliford-Lowes. We regularly ask our listeners what they'd like to hear discussed on the show, and the one topic that comes up time and time again is Coastal Command. We explored Coastal Command a little in our previous series, but today we're going to be taking a deeper dive and exploring the history and contributions of the effort of one base in particular, RAF Bircham Newton in the English county of Norfolk, just a few miles from the town of King's Lynn. This is an area of England which was littered with British and American air bases during the Second World War, and over which the skies were very busy indeed. And we're delighted to be joined today by regular listener and chairman of the RAF Bircham Newton Heritage Centre, Jamie Heffer. A very warm welcome to the show, Jamie.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me on.
Hi, Jamie. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm absolutely thrilled to be talking about Coastal Command again. It's such an endlessly fascinating topic, isn't it? I absolutely love it. But before we launch into Bircham Newton's role in the Second World War, can you give us a brief summary of its origins? Because I believe this place actually goes back to the First World War, is that right?
Yes, it does. So the aerodrome was actually opened officially on the 1st of May 1918. The site had been constructed through 1917. It took a little bit longer than they were expecting to get up and running. So it wasn't until, obviously we're in the final year of the First World War here, and it was May when it was officially opened. And it was then home to its first flying unit, which was the tongue twister, which they eventually changed. But the first unit to use Bircham Newton was Number 3 School of Aerial Fighting and Gunnery, thankfully they changed it to Number 3 Fighting School later on, which was much easier to say when you're talking about it. And the first the chief training officer for that, and what we often say to people when they visit the Heritage Centre, he was the first commanding officer to take control of the aerodrome, was a 20-year-old Major Harold Balfour. So I don't know if you've heard of Harold Balfour, but he's probably known as the fact that he was the Undersecretary of State for Air in the Second World War under Churchill. But as a 20-year-old major, he was actually the chief instructor of the fighting school at Bircham Newton. And you know, you can imagine it, a 20-year-old in charge of a bunch of sort of 18, 19-year-olds, teaching them the advanced aerial gunnery skills that they needed to survive on the Western Front. He himself had served on the Western Front, and I think he was a bit apprehensive about going back to France. And then luckily he was given charge of the school at Bircham Newton, which I think was a really good thing to happen to him, really. He'd done his bit in France, I think, as far as he was concerned. But yeah, he obviously went on to be quite the politician in that sense. He's probably quite well known for his activities during the Second World War, especially when it came to aircraft procurement. He was usually the man that people would write letters to when they had issues in the squadrons. And so he did one thing that he was quite proud of while he was at Bircham Newton, which I always tell people, is he wrote a couple of books later in life, and one of them, "An Airman Marches," is the name of the book. And in it, he claims he set a record while he was at Bircham Newton, and that was he was the first airman to fly in the nude over Hunstanton. The coastal town of Hunstanton.
Wow!
And he claims that at the time of him writing "An Airman Marches," that his record had never been beaten.
Wow! So you've heard it here first.
Yeah,
heard it here first.
So whether that's true or not, it's hard to say. But basically, what he was doing was in the summer months, he would himself and his other instructors, when they'd finished for the day, they would often get in their aircraft and fly to the coastal town of Hunstanton, land in a field, and then go for a jolly in the sea. And then when they were done, they would obviously go back to their aircraft and then fly back to the aerodrome. And on one occasion, he obviously decided to fly with no clothes on over the town of Hunstanton. So, which I think is quite amusing.
That's magnificent, absolutely magnificent.
Yeah. So that was the first group to use Bircham Newton in the First World War. But Harold Balfour and his Number 3 Fighting School, they remained at Bircham from May until October of 1918. In October there was a bit of a change up. Number 3 Fighting School was moved to Sedgeford Aerodrome, which is about 7 miles away from Bircham Newton, which had been a Royal Naval Air Service base during the First World War. And 27 Group took over Bircham in October of 1918, and they were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Redford Mullock, who was a Canadian, and he had organised the use of the giant Handley Page V-1500 bombers, which most people have never heard of. Obviously, they were the biggest aircraft we ever built during the First World War, and they were only ever used as a squadron at Bircham Newton during the First World War. The first ever squadron that was formed was at Bircham Newton in October 1918, which was 166 Squadron, and they were supposed to be used to do a very, very ambitious bombing raid of Berlin, which is going to be the first time that an aircraft flew these huge aircraft. I mean, you know, these aircraft, if you've ever seen pictures of them, and they are available, if you ever search for one, you will find a picture of them. But they were four-engine bombers. First, obviously, four-engine bombers were used in that war. And in terms of scale, because unfortunately none exists today, but I'm told that scale-wise, they're just a bit smaller than what a Lancaster bomber is. And you can imagine this is 1918. So
this is insane.
It's an incredible... Yeah, it's an incredible aircraft. And the trouble was, though, they came to Bircham too late, really. There was actually Mullock himself, obviously, who was a commander of 27 Group. He had basically said, he was a bit of a strange man, I think. He was apprehensive about them doing this mission while he wasn't at Bircham, which I don't really understand, because most commanders let their underlings do the work for them. But he was a bit apprehensive about letting them go. There was a lot of back and forth about when they should go, what the actual mission should be. The mission itself was going to be that they would fly to Berlin, they would bomb the city, they would then fly on to Prague, to an airfield there. They would then be rearmed and refueled and do a return flight back to Bircham Newton while bombing Dusseldorf on the way. That was allegedly what was going to happen.
That's insane.
Fortunately, it didn't come down to that. In fact, the story goes that I've been told that it got to the 10th of November, and it wasn't until that date that they got clear orders for this mission. And Mullock was basically in charge of either we go or we don't. And he had insisted that they go. Now, he had to then cancel that order because of terrible fog that had completely carpeted most of Norfolk that day. So he decided to reschedule this bombing mission for the 11th of November, about midday, when the weather had cleared. Overnight, two of it, because there was only 3 Handley Pages delivered to the squadron because there was such difficulties getting them into service. One of them actually was out of action for this mission, and all of the remaining, so the 2 remaining aircraft actually had to have their engines completely refitted overnight from the 10th to the 11th, and then on the morning of the 11th, they were crewed up, they were bombed up, ready to go at a word's notice. And then one of Mullock's orderlies came out apparently onto the airfield, waving his arms in the air, telling them they had to stop because the war ended at 11 o'clock. So luckily, they didn't actually take part in this mission. If they had, obviously they didn't have radios, so it could have gone past the 11 o'clock hour, and then suddenly you have possibly 2 British bombers flying over the German, over Berlin, and then dropping bombs, which obviously wouldn't have gone very well.
Heavens.
So that's sort of the first. That's really the First World War, or bit that we're sort of known for, really. If anyone's ever heard of Bircham Newton's First World War exploits, really.
So what about between the wars then? What's going on then? Is it in use, or is it sort of dormant, or what's going on?
It remained open all the way through the interwar years. The Handley Pages, as I mentioned, they eventually formed another squadron of them at Bircham Newton, which was 167 Squadron. Both of those squadrons only lasted until May of 1919. They eventually then formed a third squadron, which was 274 Squadron, which was the one that lasted the longest with the Handley Page V-1500s. Interestingly enough, the person who was the commander of 274 Squadron was a squadron leader, Arthur Tedder. And he'd obviously served in the First World War. He was then, after the war ended, he came to Bircham Newton to command 274 Squadron. He actually personally collected one of the V-1500s from a factory in Scotland. And while flying it from Scotland to Bircham Newton, obviously in Norfolk, he dropped thousands of war bond leaflets on the way. So that was something he did. Tedder then was actually 274 Squadron, was disbanded in, I think it was May of 1920, and then 207 Squadron was then reformed at Bircham Newton in 1920, and then Arthur Tedder was then in charge of that. So he was the commander of 207 Squadron in 1920, and he was there from 1920 to 1922, which apparently after the war ended, the living conditions on site were actually quite bad. So much so that there's a little story about Tedder being approached by a group of disgruntled airmen, as they were described in the piece of paper that it was written down on, basically saying that the living conditions were terrible. They weren't happy. And Tedder, in all of his professionalism, turned round to the gentlemen, got them in order, got them doing what he wanted, and said, write all of your grievances down and I will send it to the appropriate people, which is what he did. And gradually, as a result of that, living conditions did slowly improve on the site. So that was at sort of the early 1920s. And Bircham Newton remained all the way open, actively flying all the way through the 1920s. In fact, 1925, it was part of the air defence of Great Britain, and it was in the Wessex bombing area initially, which, during that time, mainly it was training of squadrons. You had plenty of different squadrons. I mean, I could name them all, but they would be here all day if I did. But one particular squadron I will note that came to the site, it was in 1925, I believe, 1926 initially, was number 7 Squadron, which was a bombing squadron. And just before the squadron moved, the last commanding officer at Bircham Newton was a then newly promoted Wing Commander Charles Portal. So Portal had obviously set his hand to do some work at Bircham Newton as well. So, which is quite an interesting little thing about these, all these different. There's so many First World War, notable airmen who served at Bircham all the way through the interwar years. But it was an interesting period because it was primarily training, it was primarily bombing, and then we move into the early 1930s. And we were moved from the Wessex group to the Central group of the Air Defence of Great Britain. And that was shortly just before the formation of the fighter, bomber, coastal command, etc.
That's the next question. So where does Bircham fit into the overall scheme of things when coastal command's found?
Well, it's interesting because obviously there was a lot of bombing that had been practiced and trained at Bircham in the interwar years, and then when they came into, obviously, Coastal Command came into being, interestingly enough, it was actually Bircham Newton. We often joke that it spent about 3 weeks in Bomber Command before they decided to actually assign it to Coastal Command. And basically what it was going to be is all of the maritime patrols were going to be done from somewhere like Bircham in Norfolk, because at that particular time, there wasn't really many airfields in Norfolk at all. In fact, in the late 20s, early 30s, Bircham Newton was the only flying station in Norfolk. Wow. So obviously, as you're going up to when Coastal Command forms, it's, there aren't that many places that can accommodate a Coastal Command station in Norfolk. And they wanted a Coastal Command station in Norfolk, and Bircham Newton seemed to be the ideal place for that. The order of the day would have been general reconnaissance over the North Sea, and obviously across the European coastline there. Mainly German, Dutch, Belgian, French coasts, you would obviously do the reconnaissance. And there was also a lot of training done with the fishing fleets, because that was a big thing that they thought of. I think that they focused more on the fishing fleets, actually, than they did the merchant convoys that sailed up and down obviously on the eastern coast. And they were very worried about the fishing fleets and the fishing boats being attacked by German submarines or German surface raiders, like the E-boats, etc., if a war was to break out. And they were quite jokingly referred to as the Kipper patrols by the people who served in them. So, and that was mainly 206 Squadron and 220 Squadron. They were both at Bircham Newton in 1936. 206 had formed at Manston and then moved to Bircham Newton, and then 220 Squadron formed at Bircham Newton in I think it was August 1936, and they were all equipped with the Avro Anson. So that was the main aircraft that would be used from the station in the event of a war. And it wasn't actually until I think it was 1939, just before the war began, that 42 Squadron arrived with their Vickers Wildebeest biplanes for anti-shipping roles. So it was really, as we were getting closer to the war in 39, the 38, 39, there was a bit more, there's possibly going to be a lot of anti-shipping that needs to be done. And what are we going to do about that? And 42 Squadron was moved to Bircham Newton for that purpose, because there wasn't really many torpedo squadrons at all. In fact, I think there was 2 in 1939, just before the war broke out. And that was 42 and 22 Squadron. And yeah, it was, so in the grand scheme of the the late interwar years, it was, how do we best protect our our fishing fleet? How do we protect our coastal convoys?
Yeah. So when the war comes along, wondered if you could explain about RAF Bircham Newton, the role it played in the Second World War, especially its service with 16th Great Coastal Command. But how did its role evolve over the course of the war? How much did it change?
It actually changed quite a bit. And in terms of what it was, the squadrons that were based there at the very beginning of the war, as I mentioned, 206 Squadron remained at Bircham until June of 1941. So they were there for quite some time. 220 Squadron moved from Bircham Newton just before the beginning of the war. As the war broke out, you had 206, you had 42. And it was, again, they were still thinking of these fishing fleets, so still thinking of these coastal convoys, and then now suddenly, is it going to be more anti-shipping? And also, that was also at that particular point in time as well, they thought the U-boats may actually be quite a problem in the North Sea. So a lot of the Ansons that from 206 Squadron were actually used on anti-submarine patrols, because 206 Squadron had often been referred to as a general reconnaissance unit. So they would obviously fly into the North Sea, hoping to catch anything on the surface if they could. Now, as we progress into 1940 and things change dramatically, obviously with the occupation of the Netherlands, Scandinavia, France, etc., suddenly there's a huge presence all along the coastline of enemy shipping, and obviously the U-boats became less of a priority in the North Sea, because a lot of this, obviously, they moved into the northwest ports, Saint Nazaire, etc., Bay of Biscay area. But these shippings that the German convoys actually that they had in that particular point in time that were beginning to form in late 1940 was mainly obviously the iron ore that we've quite often talked about, the iron ore that was being shipped from Scandinavia. So you had that shipping. You also just had general coastal shipping that was moving from Germany to the Netherlands, to Belgium, just to move equipment, because sometimes it was quicker, and sometimes you could just load it on a ship and then go from one port out into the other, and you probably get, if you did it at night, there was a good chance you weren't attacked by aircraft either. But as I say, that's 1940. We obviously have the Battle of Britain as well in that particular point in time. Coastal Command's role in that is often not really mentioned at all. In fact, as I mentioned, 206 Squadron was at Bircham. They were joined by the Blenheims squadrons as well. There was plenty of Blenheims that ended up being used at Bircham Newton. In fact, I think that at one point we had Blenheims coming out of our ears because there were so many of them.
Wow.
But it was 235 Squadron was the main Blenheim squadron that was based at Bircham in 1940. And a lot of their stuff was escorting and also attacking German shipping, anything that they could find, really. And also it was a bombing of coastal aerodromes and coastal ports that was done a huge amount by the Coastal Command squadrons that were based at Bircham Newton as well. So as you get into 1941, the role still is anti-shipping, attacking German ports, attacking German aerodromes. But at the end of 1941, we had a need for an air sea rescue squadron, and we had 279 Squadron form in November 1941 at Bircham Newton, because air sea rescue had been performed by Coastal Command, but it was very, I would say, a rudimentary way of doing it. Usually what it was is an aircraft that was out on an air sea rescue patrol would fly over, possibly spot a downed airman, and then they would try their best to call in a local, the Navy would involved as well. You had the Coast Guards involved, but it wasn't until November 1941 when we had 279 Squadron, which was a dedicated air sea rescue squadron, and their role ever increased as the war progressed. As we go into 1943, we have the arrival of the Americans, which obviously means a huge amount of air traffic from obviously the Americans, and Bomber Command were flying over the North Sea. And these downed airmen needed help, if you were to ditch in the North Sea, and a lot of that was done from places like Bircham Newton. In fact, we would end up having 2 air sea rescue squadrons operate from the site, which was 279 and 280 Squadron. And as we go into 1943, 1944, the anti-shipping squadrons start to drift off. It's mainly air sea rescue. It's also a lot of meteorology that's done from Bircham Newton as well. A lot of people have never really heard of the Met squadrons that served in the RAF, and especially with Coastal Command. And every single day, the Met squadrons would go up and they would gather the weather data that was needed, both locally and in enemy territory. As it moved, obviously, into 1944, when it got close to, obviously, D-Day, obviously operations in Normandy, we had 415 Squadron arrive here, which is a Canadian squadron. They'd arrived at the end of December 1943, and they had pretty much been tasked with using their Wellingtons to attack German E-boats and keep them away from the areas that would then be used, obviously, during Operation Overlord. There was obviously a huge worry that, such ships could fire torpedoes at maximum range and then disappear at their very high speeds into the darkness. And 415 Squadron was tasked with hunting them down. So it went a little bit back to anti-shipping, but not in the traditional way that they'd been doing it, which was hunting convoys and things like that. And then 1945, it was really wound down a lot. It was very small, groups of squadrons here. We had obviously 415. They were moved to Bomber Command in the end of 1944, which their Wellingtons were taken over by 524 Squadron here at Bircham. And we also had 119 Squadron here as well at the end of 44, beginning of 45. And they were really the last squadron to be used on the anti-shipping role in terms of looking for things like E-boats and that. And then, as the war ended, the limitations of Bircham were laid bare for all to see, because it only ever had a grass airfield. It was never ever updated in that way. There's been a lot of questions asked as to why they never built a solid all-weather runway. Honestly, I think the reason is because Bircham Newton was so busy during the Second World War. They had so many Coastal Command squadrons that were using the site, flying in and out, not just the ones at base there, but the detachments as well. And you also had the Fleet Air Arm that were using Bircham Newton as well. You also had Bomber Command flying in and out, especially when they were returning from missions, if they were short of fuel, etc. You also had various different regiment units, RAF regiment units that were using the site, and so that it was quite packed full of people. It was always busy. Fighter Command also used Bircham as well, because we were in 12 groups in their area of operation. And especially at the beginning of the war, you had 2 fighter squadrons, which were 610 and 213, that were based at Wittering, had designated Bircham Newton as their advanced landing ground. So you had not only Coastal Command aircraft flying in and out, you had Fighter Command aircraft flying in and out, and Bomber Command aircraft flying in and out. So it was, and all off a grass airfield. So it really,
chaos.
It was quite chaotic, I think it was. And interestingly enough, Bircham actually had 2 satellite airfields to accommodate all of the aircraft and squadrons. So in the village of Docking, which is about 3.5 miles away, was the main satellite airfield. And then we also had, you may have heard of it, RAF Langham. And Langham obviously famously was where a lot of the Beaufighter strike wings were used. Well, Langham actually was a second satellite airfield for Bircham Newton up until 1942. And it was in 42 when they closed Langham and then obviously built the all-weather runway. When it reopened, it could then accommodate much bigger aircraft than Bircham ever could, and obviously Docking as well. And I've spoken to some of the guys that run the Langham Doan Heritage Centre. We're quite in touch quite frequently, and there's always a discussion that comes up between us is, why did they do Langham's airfield but not Bircham? And I said, well, I think because Langham was the underused satellite airfield. They thought, if we're going to do one, we'll do one here. And also Langham is closer to the coast, actually. Bircham is a little bit more inland. So that's my opinion on it anyway. There might be an official document that states why they did it and they didn't do Bircham, but I've never seen one. So, but that's kind of a general oversight of what Bircham was used for during the Second World War.
It's amazing.
Absolutely loving it. I'm always really interested in sort of the human element Can you tell us about some of the people who served at Bircham Newton, Jamie? They came from literally all over the world, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. So we actually had, Australians, we had New Zealanders, South Africans, there were some Americans that served in some of the Coastal Command squadrons at Bircham Newton during that time. I would say some interesting people that spring to mind. So 221 Squadron, if you've ever known what it is a Wellington squadron, and they formed in November 1940 at Bircham Newton, and the commanding officer of that was a Wing Commander Thomas Vickers, or Tim Vickers as he was known. And he actually trained the squadron at Bircham Newton to such a high standard that he was awarded the DSO in February as a result of that. And his squadron was equipped with the Wellington Mark 1 Cs. They were also equipped with the ASV Mark 2 radar. So if you've ever seen any pictures of them, they have obviously the antennas on the back, often referred to as the stickleback Wellingtons, which is quite an interesting little thing. We've got a few other interesting individuals. Squadron leader Harry Purvis is another one that I like to mention. You may have heard of him in his involvement in number 1 GRU, which was what the DWI Wellingtons were formed into, the first DWI Wellington unit. That was formed at RAF Manston, and it was in March of 1940 that they formed number 2 GRU at Bircham Newton with the DWI Wellingtons. And Harry Purvis, who'd obviously commanded and been involved with the trials of the DWI as well, he came to Bircham Newton to command number 2 GRU. So we had the really strange hoopla wimpies, as they used to refer to them at the time, flying in and out. There was a gentleman actually who used to visit the Heritage Centre quite often. He lived in a village nearby. He sadly died a couple of years ago, but he was in his 90s, and Peter Collinson was his name. And he told me that as a boy he lived in the area. He said, and in the mornings him and his friends would go and sit outside on walls near the RAF camp, and he would see these huge Wellingtons with these giant donut rings, as he described it, flying over them in the morning, just so they could see them. And obviously it's something we'll probably never ever see fly again. So he was one of the few people that I knew who had seen them flying actively in March of 1940, which was quite interesting. So
amazing.
The Fleet Air Arm, as I mentioned, they often say there's quite a few interesting people in the Fleet Air Arm that were at Bircham Newton. You may have heard of the actor Peter Butterworth.
Oh yeah,
for the Carry On films.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He was, so Peter Butterworth was flying albacores at Bircham Newton in 1940 with 826 Fleet Air Arm Squadron when he was shot down. He was shot down. Flying over, I think it was over Texel on the Frisian Islands. And obviously he famously went on to be, people know him of his role in the Carry On films, but he ended up in Stalag Luft, I think in multiple different Stalag camps, but he ended up in Stalag Luft 3, I believe. And the Navy guys, they often get forgotten about. We had 7 different land-based Fleet Air Arm squadrons use Bircham Newton over the course of the entire war. So we had a lot of interesting people come to and fro, and he's one of them that I often say, because people know who he is and they've seen him on telly. So he's quite an interesting talking point as well. So actually, I mean, you can talk endlessly about the different individuals. It goes. There's so many. I mean, there could be people that we just don't even know about who are, very interesting, famous people who perhaps may have served at Bircham Newton, but perhaps they're to be discovered at some point.
Can you tell us about the loss rates at Bircham, Jamie? Because I think that it was quite high, wasn't it? In 16 groups.
Yes.
Area of operation.
Yes, it was. So just from RAF Bircham Newton, we know of 541 people killed serving there during World War II, which is obviously quite a lot when you consider, Coastal Command's losses. Obviously the number varies on the different sources you look at, but it's often said about 6,000 aircrew and personnel. Obviously 541. You're creeping close to just shy 10% of a contribution to that. So we know about 541 people that we know were definitely killed serving at Bircham Newton during the Second World War. The guys are just really kind of forgotten in there, especially in their anti-shipping role that they performed. I think the worst period was from 1941 to 1942 in terms of the anti-shipping. It was a tough year, a tough couple of years, actually. We had one of the most successful anti-shipping squadrons that served at Bircham Newton with Coastal Command was 407 Squadron, which was a Canadian squadron. They were actually nicknamed the Demons by their own press because of how successful they were and how they were so aggressive in their anti-shipping role. They'd done very successfully RAF Northcote, which is where they formed, and they found their niche kind of way of waging a war, is the best way to put it. When they were at Northcote, they were commanded by the gentleman who was a commander when they formed the squadron, which is a Wing Commander Harry Styles. And he was there's no other way to put it. He was an absolutely brilliant commander. He had really found his sweet spot, I'd say, in terms of the operations. He basically said to his guys, we're going to be like bandits in the night. We're going to be like pirates. We're going to go out only when it's favorable to us. So obviously when it's dark, in the hours of darkness, when there's bad weather. He said we will use our radar on board our Lockheed Hudsons, which is what the squadron were equipped with.
Oh, gosh.
And he said we will attack from multiple sides, and that is what we will do to maximize the effectiveness of the squadron and also keep as many people alive as possible. So that was when they were at Northcote. They then moved to Bircham Newton, and unfortunately things took a bit of a turn for the worst. Wing Commander Styles was moved on, and the squadron was taken over by a Wing Commander Brown, and he was a very good commander, but I just don't think he was as good as what Styles had been. He was I think he felt a lot of pressure. It was the best way to put it is I think it was big shoes to fill.
Yeah.
There's a chap who wrote a book about the Demons, actually, who served on the Demon Squadron, named Kim Abbott, who wrote the book Gathering of Demons. And he'd been one of the originals when the squadron formed. And he basically said, I think he was a bit, he was a good commander, but, no one was ever going to replace Styles. So when they came to Bircham Newton, it was very difficult. They had a difficult time. That was because there was a lot of pressure on Brown's shoulders from above. The squadron was doing so well, but they weren't able to confirm always their claims. We sank this ship, we damaged this ship. Well, how do you know that? And they're like, well, it was dark. Did you see anything? Well, we assumed we hit it, and that sort of crept up. And when Brown took over as CO at Bircham, he was basically told, you need to start doing this at the time of day where we can see and we can actually get a proper credit, which is quite difficult. And unfortunately, that led to the squadron suffering. And in fact, no other squadron would suffer more in one day than 407 Squadron at Bircham Newton in 1942. I often call it Black Friday. It was a terrible day for the squadron. On the 15th, the night of the 15th of May, 1942, the squadron actually were tasked with attacking a convoy that was sailing off the Dutch Frisian Islands. It was going to be a end of day raid, so it wasn't going to be complete darkness. There would be some light. We call it twilight.
Yeah.
And fortunately, that was obviously going to always be in the defenders' favour. So the mission was that in two groups of 9 aircraft, there was 12 aircraft that belonged to 407 Squadron, and there was 6 aircraft that belonged to number 320 Squadron, which was a Dutch squadron that served at Bircham Newton at that time.
Oh gosh!
And the Dutch contributed 6 aircraft, the Canadians contributed 12, and it was going to be that there were two different attacks, basically strikes. So the first group of 9 would take off. They would hopefully find the convoy and attack it. And then after that, the second group of 9 aircraft, which consisted of 3 Canadian and then 6 Dutch aircraft, would then come in to finish the job. So what happened was they took off in the evening. The second group actually was the one to find the enemy convoy first. Unfortunately, for the group number 2 that was going to come in after that, the Germans were going to be on high alert. So the first wave went in. There were some losses. The flak and the searchlights were incredibly intense. Also, the convoys were trailing barrage balloons as well, so you had steel cables in amongst all of this as well. And with the Hudson that they were using, Lockheed Hudson, you had to fly at mast height to drop your load, to hopefully hit the target ship. and it low level flying. You can imagine at that particular point in time, you've still got some light, the fading light. You can see you can see the incoming aircraft from your ships. Obviously, the supporting convoy ships, and the first group, I would say, got away with it lightly. Then number two of the second part of the group came in, and they got absolutely plastered by these AA guns all over the convoy. So that squadron, I see 407 Squadron, out of the 12 aircraft they contributed to the strike, only 7 returned, 2 of which were so badly damaged that they crash landed at Docking Satellite Airfield, and the Dutch lost 1 aircraft shot down to a German night fighter, which was actually seen by another Dutch aircraft to explode in the darkness. By that time, obviously, it had been completely dark by that point. So the Canadians lost 21 guys from their squadron. The Dutch lost 4 airmen killed. And unfortunately, one of the Canadian aircraft that had crash landed at Docking, unfortunately landed on a gun pit at the end of the edge of the airfield and killed an operator who was manning that gun pit. So it was about 26 people were killed, many which who survived it, who were sent to Ely Hospital, which is obviously used by the RAF, and it was probably the roughest night, and it was the biggest loss of life from any of the anti-shipping squadrons that we used at Bircham Newton. And they're using Lockheed Hudsons, which really aren't going to set the world on fire. Which as we know is a converted airliner originally. But we've got a photograph actually of one of the aircraft that crash landed at Docking, which obviously was a wheels up landing, and you could see in the nose of the aircraft where a cannon shell penetrated and actually exploded and blew the instrument panel completely out. And somehow the pilot of that particular aircraft, which was a pilot officer K, Canadian, he managed to navigate and land back at Bircham Newton despite being wounded and despite having no instrument panel whatsoever. So it was incredible, really, that he managed it. But unfortunately, when he did make his crash landing, one of his already wounded crew was killed. So it was very difficult. Not just for 407, obviously the Dutch as well as the Dutch squadrons, they did suffer heavily. It was just an awful job to be employed with, really. And the loss percentage that we usually give people whenever they ask, at the Heritage Centre when they visit us, it would vary between about 18 to 25% loss every time you went to attack a convoy. It was and even if you didn't by some miracle lose anybody, you would be damaged. You could lose airmen to shrapnel. It's just such a dangerous job. And as I mentioned, Squadron Leader Bullock earlier on, and he actually, I believe there's an interview with him in the Imperial War Museum's archive where he talks about serving in Coastal Command. And he mentions the anti-shipping squadrons that we used, and he says how terrible they were. He sort of goes off on a bit of a tangent, really, to talk about it. He said, no one ever remembers these people who served in these squadrons, and he obviously went to be very successful. And he says, I've not been able to fully confirm what he says in his interview, but he does say that 75% of people who served in those squadrons during the Second World War would never finish a tour with Coastal Command, which just goes to show how dangerous it was, and
that's sort of like on a par with Bomber Command 43, 44, isn't it?
Yeah. In fact, after that raid I just mentioned with 407 Squadron, there's an entry at the end of May 1942, to round off the month, in the operational record book, where, just paraphrasing here because it's quite a long bit, but basically what they say, whoever wrote it basically says that this is one of the most successful squadrons in Coastal Command. We've damaged, I think it was about 86,000 tons of shipping that they claimed damaged between April and May 1942. However, at the end of May, that there was so many damaged aircraft, there was such a great loss of air crew, and all the aircraft that were remaining in the squadron at the time were in such a terrible state that they were of no use to this or any other squadron. And it was, it really is. I always like to use 407 Squadron as the example, but it wasn't just that squadron that was in that role at Bircham Newton. We obviously had the Dutch. Before that, we had 500 Squadron with their Blenheims. We had 235 Squadron with their Blenheims that were using an anti-shipping role, 206 with their originally with their Ansons, and then they were replaced with Hudsons. Their anti-shipping role that they were slowly being used with as they got into 1941. So it's, these squadrons are just never really spoken about. Most people, when you talk about Coastal Command and the anti-shipping role, it's always the bow fighters, and that usually obviously comes later in the war. And really, the reason why I think the bow fighters were so successful in late war period was because we'd learnt a lot of lessons.
Absolutely,
between the beginning of the war, especially through 1941 and 1942. It was a horrific period of time.
Yeah, God, that's just doesn't even bear thinking about, does it? Unbelievable.
Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about the air sea rescue role developed at Bircham Newton?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, we had 1941 in November, we had 279 Squadron 4. And as the war went on, I think 279 was the main air sea rescue squadron at Bircham Newton. So as the war progressed, you may have heard of the different versions, but most people have heard of the Lindholm gear, which is obviously quite famous. But before that, you had the first version was the Thornaby bag, which was developed at RAF Thornaby, and which was basically a canvas bag filled with equipment and what you needed, medical equipment and that, to be dropped to airmen who were obviously down in the North Sea there, or in the English Channel when they'd been shot down. After that, we then had the Bircham barrel, which was developed at RAF Bircham Newton, which was basically a 250-pound bomb, which had the nose and the tail cut off, and then they would fill it with, again, equipment that we needed to drop to down airmen. So you'd have rations, you've had medical equipment, flares, flare pistols, etc. And then finally, after the Bircham barrel, we had the Lindholm gear, which came with the different various Lindholm dinghies as well. So you had obviously multiple tubes that we dropped. You had a Lindholm dinghy that you could drop to the airmen. And that was sort of, from the period of 1941 up until early 1943. And obviously then, if you've ever heard of it, which most people haven't heard of, was the introduction of the airborne lifeboats. And 279 Squadron at Bircham Newton was the first air sea rescue squadron to drop the airborne lifeboat during the Second World War. The squadron had been involved in the trials for the airborne lifeboat, and I believe it was March 1943 where the first airborne lifeboat was actually deployed with good success, and it was the lifeboat was actually dropped by the chap who flew that plane was a Flight Sergeant Mogridge, and he dropped his airborne lifeboat to a Halifax that was down in the North Sea of number 102 Squadron.
Yeah.
So that was the first time that it'd been used, and as the war obviously went on, more and more uses of the airborne lifeboat were being deployed from the squadrons at Bircham Newton. So it really did make people feel better. Not just obviously in Coastal Command, because the chaps who served in Bomber Command, and as well as the American Air Force. Actually, it was quite clever when they were the 279 Squadron, especially because it was actually said to the squadron that when these airmen who you drop these airborne lifeboats to, when they are rescued, they would get an invitation to come to Bircham Newton, and then they would be shown around the air sea rescue equipment. They actually had a specific part of the operations block which was dedicated to just showing off air sea rescue equipment to the guys who'd been shot down and rescued. They would then go to their bases and they would tell everyone, we've been rescued by this equipment. We went to Bircham Newton. They showed us this is what to expect if you are shot down in the North Sea, etc. They're really looking out for us. In fact, the commander at the time of 16 Group, he actually visited the station and basically said morale was so good in 1943 as a result of what this squadron is doing, and they really found their niche with it. The squadron was incredibly successful, and the guys who flew on these missions were put at great risk to themselves. You were flying sometimes in very close proximity to the Dutch, to the German coasts, and on a few occasions you were obviously attacked by enemy aircraft and shot down yourself, and then you had to be hopefully rescued by your own squadron. In fact, as I mentioned, Flight Sergeant Mogridge obviously was the first to drop the airborne lifeboat. That was on, was it the 5th of May, 1943? It was the 15th of May where he went out to do another air sea rescue drop, and he was attacked by a Dornier 24 flying boat, and his rear gunner, Flight Sergeant Edward Rusby, was killed in the gunner's position. They managed to make it back to Bircham, and he was on an air sea rescue. He was trying to save lives of people who were down in the North Sea, and he himself fell victim, unfortunately. They weren't shot down, but he lost a guy. So, and it just goes to show the tremendous courage of these squadrons. It was really, it was incredibly brave. It really was. And again, you can't big up any more than it, just pure courage, in my opinion. There,
absolutely.
And they basically timed their flights as well with Bomber Command. So when Bomber Command had planned a mission, and they would know the timing that they would be flying back over the North Sea, 279 Squadron would usually send their aircraft out, and hopefully they would be in the general area if an aircraft came down and crashed in the North Sea. So they would be prepared to immediately drop lifeboats and life-saving equipment to them. So yeah, it's a part of Coastal Command that most people don't really know about. And 279 Squadron worked in with its what we call the parented marine craft unit, and the closest one to Bircham was at Wells next to sea, and that was, I believe, 53. I think it was 50C Squadron, they called it, marine craft unit. And basically, once the equipment is dropped down to the airmen, you would then call in and radio in, and that would then be passed on to the marine craft units. They would send a high speed launch, and the aircraft would then fly around in the area for as long as possible, and then hopefully that gives you a good, when the marine crafts are going out, that gives you a good sighting. If you could see the aircraft, and in the general area where the guys are. So it was, they worked very, very well together. In fact, the marine craft unit guys on occasion were invited to Bircham Newton from Wells to be taken on goodwill flights, to just be sort of thrown around, really, which which is really sort of a nice gesture.
Yeah,
all the hard work that they were doing together. So that was quite a little interesting one there.
Gosh, this is so fascinating.
It's brilliant.
So we're going to, just going to round things up now. Maybe talk a little bit about the post-war period before its closure in 1962. But also, can you tell us about the role of RAF Bircham Newton Heritage Centre, its location, and how you got involved?
Yeah. So post-war, as I say, the grass airfield was at its limitations, really, and everybody knew that. You had locally, if you know your airfields in Norfolk, which obviously there were so many that were built in Norfolk, we had the huge American base, RAF Sculthorpe, which is just down the road from us, which became an absolutely massive American base in the Cold War period. You also had RAF West Raynham, which is also a concrete airfield, only about 15-20 minute drive from Bircham Newton. So that, you had all these concrete airfields that can accommodate much bigger aircraft, and you can't run jets off grass airfields, which was obviously, the big problem. So really, not to go on too much about it, but mainly the post-war use of the site was training and admin training. In fact, in 1950, as part of the Air Technical Training Command, it was designated the School of Administration, and there was a lovely sign that they built that said RAF Bircham Newton School of Administration, and they brought all of the admin courses to Bircham, and that was what they were doing. So they did the admin courses, they did the officers training as well, and then in the late 1950s they also moved the RAF Administrative Apprentice School from Hereford to Bircham Newton, and they trained there. So you had your young 15, 16-year-olds, and they trained on site until 1962, and that was when the decision was made to finally give up the site. So it had 44 years as a very important airfield. Obviously, as I mentioned, one point in period of time, it was the only flying station in Norfolk. Ironically, which I like to point out to people, after the station closed in about 1964, at that point the site was being prepared for auction, and the MOD still owned the site and the airfield, the grass airfield. At West Raynham, you had the trials that were being done with the Kestrel, which was obviously, the Kestrel was the prototype for what would be the Harrier jump jet. To do the grass trials, they actually thought, well, there's Bircham Newton just closed just down the road, so we'll just use that. So they obviously they used to fly the Kestrels down. So when people ask me what was the last thing to fly out of Bircham Newton, I say, well, ironically, it's a jet, which is what killed off Bircham Newton as an RAF station. So I know it obviously flew up and down, vertically, but that was really where it, its post-war history was mainly training. It had all been wound down, and in 1966, the whole site was bought by the Construction Industry Training Board, and from then onwards, still to this day, the whole site is used for training construction for young apprentices and things. So where the grass airfield was, there's cranes, etc., where they do all the big crane and digger driving and all that. As a result of that, if you were to walk around the site today, which unfortunately because of all the health and safety rules you can't, but if you were allowed to, it nigh on dates back, all the way back to the 1930s. It looks near enough the same as it did during the Second World War. There's a few First World War buildings still scattered in amongst the site. So, it's probably one of the most well-preserved former RAF stations in the whole country in that respect.
Amazing.
It's still going strong. So, and we have a heritage centre there, which is, we're very, very, very grateful to the Construction Industry Training Board who own the site. They allocated us a building for us to have a museum in, and which is what the Heritage Centre is. It was started in 2005 when originally there was a memorial put up, because there was never a memorial on site. And there was a memorial erected outside, and then the building next to the memorial, which is the 1921 original station commander's house from the 1920s. We have the building there to have all of the history and obviously the heritage that we keep. We have a record of all of our losses. We're still building on our archive as well, which I don't think will ever be finished. We constantly get people who get in touch with us and say, I found that my granddad served at Bircham Newton. Can you tell me more? Yeah. That's the purpose of the museum. And it's been around since 2005, and I was involved firstly in 2018 when I was a 26-year-old. I was invited by one of the guys to join the team because my grandfather actually served at the site. He served there in the 1950s as a national serviceman, and when I came and after he passed away, I brought the photographs and everything that he had, and I took them to the Heritage Centre. And one of the guys was just like, "Have you ever thought about volunteering?" And I was like,
brilliant.
"Well, not really. I can give it a go if you like." And then at the end of 2021, the former chairman, David Jacklin, who really is sort of a walking encyclopedia for Bircham Newton, and he'd been there since its founding, he offered me the position of chairman because he was stepping down. He turned around and said, "You're a young man. We need young people to do this sort of thing. Will you take over?" And I was sort of scratched my head a bit and said, "I've never really took over a museum before and have no idea what I'm doing." I said, "But rather that than see it close or anything worse happen." So I've been running the show since the end of 2021. So it's such a privilege. It really is, especially when you get people come in who share their stories with you, who say, "Here's my grandfather's logbook. Here's my dad's logbook. Can you tell me what can you tell me more?" So we show them around. We show them all the history we've got. And the main purpose of the museum is that really it is a memorial to those who served there, and especially the 541 people that we know were killed there during the Second World War, which we have now in the Heritage Centre, which is a recent addition. We have a big board on the wall which lists everybody's names, and so when people come into the Second World War room, there's the board, and it encourages people to look at their own heritage and maybe think to yourself, did my family serve in the Royal Air Force, or is there anybody that I know? We want to encourage, the sort of education of people when they come to the Heritage Centre, and that's what it's all about. It's all about the memorial to the guys and the women who served there. The men, the WAFs, the ground crew, all of them. You could sit here and talk about it for a long period of time. It's hard to cram 44 years worth of history into your head. I can tell you that it's very difficult to remember all of that off the top of your head.
Well, Jamie, you're an absolutely fantastic ambassador for the centre. You really are, and for Bircham Newton generally.
Thank you.
I've just enjoyed that episode so much. It was been absolutely fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Such a lot to think about, and I'm sure many of our listeners will want to delve into the history of the base in much more detail. So coming up in future episodes, we'll be talking to Sarah Lou Miller about Operation Exodus. And we're going to be looking at some of the incredible stories of airmen who won the Victoria Cross while serving with Bomber Command. I know that's a pet project of James's. We're going to be welcoming Alan Alport back to talk about the official histories and how they influenced post-war opinions on Bomber Command, and something I'm very excited about. We're going to be talking about the head of the Norwegian War Grave Service, Håkon Vinje, about some of the aircrew who rest in Norway, and about some of the Norwegians who flew with the Royal Air Force during the war too. And we're going to be doing another Q&A session too. So please do send in your questions on social media or to our email address at nmtdambusters@gmail.com. For all the full details are on the show website and in the show notes anyway, so you can find them all there.
Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Do leave us a review or a star rating wherever you find your podcasts. For early access to episodes, live streams, Q&A sessions, please consider becoming a subscriber for as little as £2.40 per month. The link is in the show notes or at nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com. Please also feel free to join our Facebook discussion group, which is open to all listeners, and follow us on our various social media platforms.
I'll see you all again very soon. Thank you for listening. Bye.